Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
Brought to you by the good people at Polyhymnia. Ant, what's new and exciting in your world this week?
Listener David Schoen wrote and asks, does the term recession just mean economic stress? I'm not talking about the actual definition of the term, but consistently when polled, more people believe we're in a recession than we actually are. And he asks, I'm wondering if this is simply coded language for, quote, I'm feeling economically under the gun. And you know, I never thought about it, but I think he's absolutely correct. That's what it is. The technical definition is very involved, and I don't even know what it is, but it turns out that you can approximate it with 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth. That's the technical definition. But most people don't know that. So I would imagine they just look around and ask, are they feeling better off or worse off? And this matches Milton Friedman said some time ago, it's a recession when your neighbor loses his job. It's a depression when you lose yours. And that's probably about right. Yeah.
There's something to that. And we're going to take a look at all kinds of economic indicators today, but most people are experiencing a little bit of difficulty right now.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are. Unemployment's ticked up a bit. Inflation, we went through the 2022 and you saw prices rise. You never saw them come back down. Now they stopped rising as fast, but I think people were expecting that we'd get back to where we were, and we didn't get back to where we were.
Yeah, I don't know why people were expecting that. That seems to be Pollyannish,
right?
To some degree. I mean, and we've talked about this quite a lot, right? When inflation comes and prices go up and up and up and up, and then inflation levels off, prices don't go back down again.
Right. The economists say, oh, good, we're back to low inflation. But that simply means that things stopped getting bad.
I'm still spending $8 a dozen for eggs at the grocery store.
Yeah. Now, having said that, the median wage has risen faster than inflation, going back to if you compare today versus prior to COVID. But again, there's this psychological thing. We feel it. We feel the pain of the prices going up. We feel it intensely, particularly when inflation was close to 10%. You don't feel so much as intensely the pay hike.
Yeah, no, that all seems right. And I don't know how this is all going to shake out or what it looks like in 1, 2, 5, 10 years, but it's probably going to be a little more painful than people think it is right now, largely because of what you keep talking about month after month, year after year, the new normal with the inflation rate.
Yeah.
It's not going to get better.
Right. We're not going back to the 1 point something inflation. It's going to be 2 point something.
Which means that people's lives aren't going to get better.
Yeah, I suppose there's 2 things here. One is the objective. To what extent does your life get better? The other is, and perhaps more important, this is what David was getting at, is the subjective. If I'm expecting 1% inflation, I keep feeling 2%, something feels off, something feels wrong. And you can look at the numbers and say, oh no, you're better off, adjusted for inflation than you were before, but I don't feel that. And if I don't feel it, I'm going to respond negatively to these polls.
Yeah, well, speaking of things that people feel, I got an interesting thing. You know how I like to keep track of the medical news, and you might not be terribly surprised that I am fascinated by things about Parkinson's disease for all kinds of obvious reasons. And there's a thing, it's coming out of Japan, and there are 2 separate streams that come into consonance here. The first is, well, I mean, most people only know Parkinson's through Michael J. Fox.
Right.
They remember him being a young guy on the go, and then all of a sudden couldn't stop shaking, and that's how people perceive the disease, and I think reasonably so. Why is it that nothing good has happened in Parkinson's research in 40, 50 years.
Yeah, I guess not. It didn't occur to me till you just said it, but I can't think of seeing anything in the news.
No, for your entire lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And then on the other side, we have what's been an abject failure in American medicine, or global medicine for that matter, with stem cells. Stem cells seem to do almost nothing that they were
Right. Touted to do, yeah.
advertised to do. However, it turns out the Japanese, God bless them, are reprogramming the Parkinson's brain with stem cells.
Really?
They're implanting stem cells in the brain, and those stem cells are, optimistically, I think would be maybe the best word, reversing the problems that Parkinson's brings. Which is astonishing.
Yeah.
I mean, we've got a disease that nobody's gotten anywhere with, and a treatment that doesn't seem to treat anything.
And what do you know? They go together.
And what do you know? Two great tastes that taste great together are yielding some pretty good output here. Mm-hmm. Isn't that astonishing? And, it's just another one of those things for the people who say, oh, yeah, nothing ever gets cured. It's almost like people think of medical issues now the same way they think of the cell phone bill that they pay every month, right? It's just, well, what can you do? You're just going to have to pay it.
Right, right.
And yet, here we have something that really looks like it runs the risk of being quite astonishing. And you just know that if it works, people are going to say, see, they didn't cure it. Now you got to take all your stem cells and take 33 pills a day, which you do have to take 33 pills a day, apparently, afterwards to make this work. But nonetheless, I think this is cause for optimism.
Oh, I think it is too. And I'm going to come back to what I've said often, that we're not thankful enough. Because I can tell you, if they came out tomorrow with one injection and you're completely cured for the rest of your life, people will cheer for about 6 months, and then all of a sudden they'll start complaining. Well, that thing costs $500. Well, hello. 6 months ago, it was infinity because it didn't exist.
That's right. All I can say is I can't wait for somebody to drill a hole in my head and dump a bunch of stem cells in there so we can see how this works. But of course, this brings us to the foolishness of the weekend. And, we're recording this on June 20, one day after June 19th, or as it's come to be known in the holiday world, Juneteenth. And this is a pretty big day. And I'll put an article I wrote about this in the show notes, and another one that our friend Tom Cranwitter wrote about exactly this, so you can get a sense of the depth of Juneteenth. It's unfortunate that we call it Juneteenth, I think, because it sounds a little silly, but people didn't rightly know which day it was when they got the news. They know about which day it was, and it was in the teens in June in Galveston, Texas, considerably after hostilities of the Civil War had ceased, when federal troops rolled in and informed the slaves that they weren't slaves anymore. What could be better? What could be more American a holiday than that?
Yeah.
When we can step back and say, finally, human equality.
Yeah.
And we got all kinds of problems before and after, so I don't want to make too much of it, but it's really quite a lovely thing. And Donald Trump, God help us all, comes out on June 19th and claims we have too many non-working holidays.
Oh, come on. What is it with, I mean, the stuff he does right, it's like he's got a mole in his PR group, and they just build very bad optics around whatever it is.
But very bad optics doesn't even begin to cover it. And yet here we are. And, one of the things that he criticized was that, well, let me read his remarks to you. too many non-working holidays in America. It is costing our country billions of dollars to keep all these businesses closed. The workers don't want it either. Soon we'll end up having a holiday for every one working day of the year. It must change if we are going to make America great again, because here we are. He wrote on Truth Social. But here's the thing. Businesses don't have to take the day off.
No, they don't. And what is this business about workers don't want it? I don't know of anybody who complains, oh my God, I've got another day off.
I got another day off. What a bunch of red hot nonsense this is.
Wow.
But if businesses don't want to offer holidays, they most certainly don't have to. The federal government does.
Right.
I don't think federal holidays are costing us billions. I mean, we're already paying trillions. I don't know what you could want to take away from that. But that tone deafness that he brings to this office is remarkable. It's just remarkable. You want to make a point about federal holidays, pick a different one. Pick
Right.
President's Day, maybe. If you're a United States president moaning about things, pick President's Day. But, of course, that's never going to happen. That will happen right after we cancel the military parade.
So I wonder, you're beating on him about this, but honestly, how much of this was due to him versus tone deafness of whoever's in charge of his PR?
Yeah, and I have no idea.
Yeah.
I really don't. We've always had, since I was a boy, since you were a boy, we've always had, roughly speaking, one federal holiday per month. And right now we have 11 with another one every 4 years on Election Day. That just doesn't seem too ridiculous to me.
Yeah, particularly when the Europeans have, I don't know what they have, but I know people point to the Europeans as having far more days off than we do.
Well, I think the French take off every summer.
Yeah, and, I have friends in Canada who will rib me about, oh, Americans have to work all this time, blah, 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 and the Canadians don't, to which I then point to the GDP per capita of the U.S. versus Canada, and that's the other side of that coin.
For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. We give a special shout-out to our Patreon sponsors who help us keep the lights on. If you'd like to contribute, go to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers.
Well, seeing as how you've said GDP per capita.
I want to talk this week about the Congressional Budget Office. You and I talk about this from time to time. And the CBO is one of, I'd say, 3 major bodies within the government that produces forecasts for the economy and for the budget. And let me list these 3 because they're worth mentioning. CBO, of course, Congressional Budget Office, the Joint Committee on Taxation, that's the JCT, and the Office of Management and Budget, that's the OMB. And you can distinguish them kind of in the following way. OMB works for the president. That's an executive branch body, and they answer to the president. So whatever sorts of political weight is put onto forecasts, you'll get it in the OMB. JCT answers to Congress, a little bit less in the partisan arena there, although you could imagine that which congressmen, which senators are sitting on this committee is going to push it one way or the other. Now, I don't know how this is determined. I do know that they attempt to keep it balanced. But then CBO, and CBO probably does, I would guess, the most work of the 3, and they're a straight-up nonpartisan entity. Their mantra is, we're here to produce forecasts and damn the politics. Having said that,
Yeah, except...
yeah, and I put the except here with kind of an asterisk, not to say that the exception is partisan, but is to say that CBO, generally speaking, produces what are called static forecasts. Now, they produce a whole bunch of forecasts, and for those of you who are particular about the details here, we're going to be talking about what's called the baseline forecast. So they're straight up first shot forecasts. The baseline forecasts do a couple things. First off, they tend to be static forecasts, which means CBO will tend to assume that there are no secondary effects from something. So, for example, you raise tax rates. As economists, we know that's going to slow the economy. CBO will tend to say no, that we're just assumed that the economy moves on as usual. So the static forecasts are one thing. And don't read anything into this. It's not a conspiracy. The fact is, it's really hard to do the opposite of static forecasting. The opposite is called dynamic forecasting, where you say, okay, well, we're going to raise tax rates and that's going to slow the economy, but now we've got to answer the question, slow it by how much? And all of a sudden, there's all sorts of room for personal judgment calls and opinions to come into play here, which you don't have with the static. Now, having said that, here's the problem with the static. As I was doing this work that we're going to talk about, this became very clear to me. Static forecasting is one-way biased. That is, it's going to be too optimistic on the effects of tax hikes, because the assumption is that you're going to raise taxes and it's not going to have any deleterious effect on the economy. Tend to be too optimistic when it comes to talking about tax hikes, and too pessimistic when it comes to talking about tax cuts, for the same reason that we know that when there's a tax cut, it's going to boost the economy, but with static forecasting, you assume, no, the economy is going to continue as it was. And so it's kind of like built into this thing that static forecasting is going to favor bigger government. But this is CBO. I want to talk about, now they produce these forecasts multiple times a year. I want to talk about the suite of forecasts they produced for a while, and we're going to go back to 1997.
That's a long time.
Well, that's as far back as the data I have is readily available. Going back to 1997, CBO has produced a total of 253 forecasts that we now have actuals we can compare to. And for those of you that are furiously doing the math, keep in mind what goes on here. CBO makes multiple forecasts throughout the year, and every time they make the forecast, they make forecasts for the current year, for next year, the year after that, out to 10 years out. So every time they do this, they're throwing off all sorts of forecasts. We've got a total of 253 here that we could look at. And I broke them into three groups. 253 forecasts of future federal tax revenue, 253 forecasts of future federal spending, and 253 forecasts of future federal debt.
Where will we start?
Well, let's start with tax revenues. Now, what you would expect is an unbiased forecaster. Look, forecasting is hard. You're not going to get it right. But an unbiased forecaster should over-forecast about as often as he under-forecasts. Half the time he's too high, half the time he's too low.
Exactly as often, one might say.
Yeah, the perfectly unbiased forecaster is going to be high by the same amount that he's low. And what you find here is, well, there's a very clear pattern, but it's not that. Of the 253 forecasts for future federal tax revenue, CBO overestimates the future tax revenue 74% of the time.
Imagine that.
74% of the time. It's too rosy.
I was about to ask what the odds would be on such a thing, but as I think about it in the moment, I'm a little surprised that it was only 74%.
Oh, you would have expected more. Oh, yeah, hold my beer, James. We're just getting started here.
Okay.
Because, so CBO is overly rosy with their forecasts of federal tax revenues. And when it comes to federal spending, you would say, well, okay, well, if they're too rosy with the federal revenues, maybe they're also too rosy with the spending, and it comes out in the wash. Oh, no, pumpkin. The CBO, of their 253 forecasts of future federal spending, they underestimated the spending 67% of the time.
Yeah, here we go.
Yeah, so they're too rosy on the tax revenue side. They're too rosy on the spending side, which means that when it comes to forecasting the debt, Yes,
Pick
James.
me.
You have a
Pick me.
question?
No, I have a prediction. I predict that they're going to be too rosy when it comes to looking at the debt.
Very good, too rosy. And what fraction of the time?
I've been paying attention, and on the debt, I'm guessing 85% of the time.
90% of the time.
90. Ooh.
90% of the
God.
time, when CBO gives you a forecast for the future debt, it is too low.
All right, but let's back up a step, right? Because we got yelled at by the guy who runs CBO a while back, right? Saying that, we're being unfair and blah, blah, blah. And he seemed like a perfectly reasonable human being. And one of the constraints that he and they operate under is that they have to take whatever Congress tells them and spin it out.
Yeah, from time to time, they'll be given assumptions that they have to incorporate. This happened back in the Obama years, and it was caused a big to-do because the White House asked CBO to assume that the economy, this would have been following the housing crisis. Following the housing crisis, the economy was going to grow at dot-com era growth for the next decade, which was just a ridiculous assumption. Of course, with that assumption, you get all kinds of nice things about burgeoning tax revenues. You can justify additional spending and all that stuff. But CBO kind of, to the extent it could, put its foot down, put a big old footnote in their forecasts, in effect politely saying that this was an unreasonable assumption.
It was. It was a deeply unreasonable assumption.
But another thing that happens here with CBO forecasts, and this is particularly the baseline that we're talking about here, with the baseline forecasts, they assume no changes in policy moving forward. So whatever policy exists right now is going to exist into the future. Now, there's pluses and minuses there. On the one hand, you can say something like, well, yeah, we know that Congress is going to do something about Social Security. Okay, but until Congress does something about Social Security, the forecast is it's going to hit the wall in about 7 or 8 years.
Yeah.
Now, you can ask me to change the forecast based on the assumption that Congress does something, but, to me, that's kind of hand-waving because Congress hasn't done anything.
And won't.
Well, yeah, or when they do, then we can change the forecast.
I get the criticism, but I don't know what to make of any of this, right? This is, in the end, what we're looking at here is an arm of the federal government, once again passing judgment on the federal government and deciding, not surprisingly, that the federal government has everything working in its favor.
Yeah.
And that's just ridiculous. That's not going to happen.
Well, there's a bright side to all of this. And the bright side is that while CBO consistently, and I mean consistently, 90% of the time, underestimates the future debt, it does so somewhat consistently. So we can look at by how much they've underestimated the future debt in the past, and we can adjust their current forecasts for that amount.
So is there a current percentage by which they very typically miss the mark?
Yeah, it varies depending on how far into the future they're forecasting. For example, their 5-year forward forecast of the debt is about 28% off.
Is that all?
Their 10-year forecast is about 45% off. So almost
all right,
half.
back. Come on, 45%?
Oh, yeah, it's gargantuan. Yeah.
Good. Come on.
And this really makes me mad because at least I started to notice it back in 2007. I don't know if it happened prior to that, but 2007, I started to notice that every time a forecast came out or a politician quoted, here's going to be the effect of this bill if it gets passed, they're always talking about 10 years. So they'll say things like, this bill will generate $3 trillion in revenue.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's over 10 years.
And then it turns out not to be true anyway.
Right, because they often do, when I say they, I mean the lawmakers, they schedule these things, they backfill them. So tax hikes occur later.
And I can put this in terms that a lot of our listeners will understand, at least those of our listeners who like sports. If you're a fan of the NFL, what you'll see over and over and over again is that wide receiver X or quarterback Y, whatever, just got a 5-year, $100 million contract.
Right.
Right? Okay. $8 million the first year, $9 million the second year, and you get cut the third year.
Mm-hmm.
So you never get that money.
Right.
And it's kind of the same animal here.
Yeah, it's $100 million if you stay on for a bunch of years. Right. It's the same kind of thing here.
Which you will not.
Yeah.
No politician can look at the American people with a straight face and say, yeah, this is what's going to happen the next 10 years.
Yeah, and it's really maddening because what happens is they'll have a bill that has some badness and some goodness to it, and they'll backload the badness, and the goodness will be up front. So they look at this thing and they say, oh, yeah, in total, this is a good thing. You get the goodness, but the badness gets shoved off into some future generation. Some future Congress needs to deal with it.
Yeah, it's essentially they're saying, life is good, don't worry about it.
Right, yeah. Go ahead and charge that extra meal out.
Knock yourselves out. What could possibly go wrong?
Because we'll be getting a raise in 10 years.
That's right. Everything is going to work out just fine, don't you worry. And look, we've got decades of that happening.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. These numbers that we're looking at here, that I'm quoting to you, are based on figures going back to 1997, so however long that is.
But, you know, every time, whether they use these exact words or not, when they say don't worry about it, and we look at our history, our parents' history, and our grandparents' history, say, don't worry about it was the correct answer. Mm-hmm. And it will be the correct answer right up until the second that it's not.
That's correct, yes. On that note, let's look forward. As of today, CBO is projecting that the federal debt will be $60 trillion in 10 years. That's up from the $32 trillion today.
There's no way in hell that's the correct answer. Anybody who can look at the line on a graph knows that that's not the correct answer.
Oh, yes, because you see, it's not a line, it's a curve. It slopes straight up.
Straight up, that's right, straight up.
So CBO right now is projecting that the federal debt will hit $60 trillion in 10 years. And if they're off by the same amount that they have historically been off, then you can add another 27 to that. That puts us at almost $90 trillion come 2035. $90 trillion. Now,
let me ask a math geek question. Not that I'm a math geek, but I know one. If we end up at $90 trillion, what percentage of our budget will have to be spent servicing the debt?
Oh, beautiful question, because that's my next answer.
One that you already had answered.
Right.
Perfect.
So, assuming interest rates stay where they are, and all of this doesn't jack them up tremendously. So this is going to be a rosy forecast. Assuming interest rates stay where they are, we end up with $90 trillion in debt by 2035. 45 cents out of every tax dollar will be going to pay interest, not to pay down the debt, to pay interest on the debt. 45 cents out of every tax dollar.
And we've said this before, and I think people kind of giggle when we say it. I don't think they believe us. We will never pay our debt.
No, that has been the case for a long time. What's becoming new is we're not going to be able to service it. That is, okay, you roll it over. So long as you make the minimum monthly payment, you're good. That's the interest. Well, we're going to get to the point here where we can't afford the interest either.
How long do you figure that takes?
I figured that it's already come to pass. But the numbers aren't big enough for it to be obvious to everybody.
Just say more words.
Well, let's see. We're currently at $32 trillion. And at $32 trillion, and the average interest on the debt is 3%, we're at almost $1 trillion a year in interest. And our deficit is larger than that. In other words, if we could cut the deficit all the way down to zero, if we could have a balanced budget today, we still wouldn't be able to afford the interest on the debt.
Oh, man. That's even worse than we've been saying.
Yeah, except we've been seeing this. I mean, you and I have talked about this. We've said this is coming, this is coming, this is coming. And, well, now here it is. It's just, it showed up in the numbers, just not bad enough to show up in the media.
It's arrived. It's been coming, and now it's arrived.
Now, let me give you another interesting factoid I ran across the other day. All the money that's borrowed per year on the planet, and so this is all of the governments that are borrowing, all the corporations that are borrowing, of all the money that's borrowed on the planet in a given year, our federal government borrows 10%. By 2035, that number is going to be around 25%. Of all the money borrowed on the planet, our federal government will be borrowing 25% of it. And this really starts to hit home at this thing that you and I have said, and we've been excoriated for saying it, that we're reaching a point where the federal government is running out of places on planet Earth to borrow money. And when that happens, as that happens, I should say, it pushes interest rates up because you've got this gargantuan appetite for borrowing money. So, of course, anytime you have a gargantuan appetite for anything, it's going to drive the price of the thing up. In this case, the interest rate.
As luck would have it, Ant, interest rates are at historic lows.
No, they aren't.
Oh, wait, no. Oh, wait, they're not. Oh,
No,
wait, they're not.
not only-
This is going to cause even more problems.
Yeah, not only are they not, but you look at all of the forecasters, and none of them, even the optimistic forecasters, are not forecasting that interest rates will fall back to where they were prior to COVID. Which, interestingly, is the same story that you hear for forecasts about inflation. And these two things are related. As the federal government borrows more and more, one of two things has got to happen. Either it goes to markets to borrow, driving up the interest rate, or the Federal Reserve prints money to help finance, but that drives up inflation. And so now we're seeing it in forecasters across the country. Even the optimists don't see us returning either on inflation or interest rates back to where we were prior to COVID.
Right, and what we end up with is you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Now there's nothing we can do. It's akin to a death spiral.
Right, yes.
Well, ain't that a kick in the pants?
So you and I said, and it was many years ago, and we only said it once. I was kind of embarrassed to say it, but I'm getting less embarrassed to say it now. We predicted maybe 5 years ago, 7 years ago, that this ends with a new dollar.
You know I'm going to go further than that.
Yeah, at some point we throw up our hands and we say, okay, we're going to create the new U.S. dollar bill. And it's going to have some official exchange rate, and you have so long to trade in your old dollars for the new dollars. But what all of that magic does in effect is give you a one-shot massive inflation, which reduces the purchasing power of your dollars, the point being to relieve the pressure on this debt.
We're in real trouble here.
Yeah, the only reason I hesitate is because there's a wild card, and the wild card is technology. It's possible that something comes along, maybe it's AI, maybe it's something else we haven't even thought of, that gives us a massive boost to our economy, and in so doing, a massive boost to tax revenue.
Interesting. I can't imagine what that thing would be, but that's the very nature of the thing.
Right, you can't imagine it. Yeah.
You can't imagine what it would be. So, on how to put this, I could hear the howls of laughter before I even say this. I'm generally an optimist. Generally. But not over this. I don't think anything gets us out of this pit that we're in. Now, having said that, The Japanese have been doing a pretty nice job of living in this zip code for quite some time, right? There's all kinds of mathematical difficulties when you look at what's going on in Japan, and yet they're still getting on.
Yeah, I think there are some differences with Japan in terms of how their debt is structured. Putting the details aside, Japan hasn't been doing that great. And by not doing that great, remember, these are the guys that went through at least 10 years of the doldrums of sub 1% economic growth. Their population is declining.
It was dreadful, and it continues in many respects to be dreadful. And when you look at their debt versus GDP, it's way out of hand.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, it is. It's way worse than ours. Now, having said that, their debt to GDP is worse than ours, but it's also, their debt's a fraction of ours.
Yeah, that's right. So you wonder how that shakes out in the end. I don't know. It's just a counterexample to what I'm saying about our inability to claw back from where we are.
Yeah.
There may be a way that I'm just not thinking of, but I don't know, man. It's pretty grim.
Yeah. On the face of it, it's grim. As an economist, I have to say, look, something's going to change out there, and it's going to change for the better. I have no idea what that is, but every piece of history I look at, from now going backwards to the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, tells me that there's something that's going to happen that's going to make this better.
Do you even have an inkling as to what it might be?
No, other than to say it's going to be technology. You know, people are concerned about AI taking jobs and all of that. We may well end up in a space where AI or something like it makes us so productive that most of us don't have to work at all.
Well, that's interesting you would say that. And all I'm going to say right now is stay tuned until next week, because we're right back at something kind of like that.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time,
Send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.